What if I told you the pursuit of artificial intelligence is pushing the current generation toward the fulfillment of biblical prophecy that's been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years? In this video, I'm going to read you an article that reveals the shocking connection between AI development and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Why the Tower of Babel was the first warning against such technological pride. How the prophets describe the results of the current technological revolution. We are currently living in the sixth day of creation and waiting for the seventh day to begin. The author of this article has spent more than 50 years translating and studying what the Hebrew prophets say about the end of the age. What he has only recently learned about AI's role in biblical prophecy will, if you believe it, completely change how you see today's technological revolution. Stay tuned to learn what God really thinks about artificial intelligence and why insight into the information in this article is absolutely essential right now. The Voice of Elijah. April 2025. How does God view AI, artificial intelligence? Copyright 2025, Larry D. Harper. Read by Chris, an AI from Play.ht. Over the past 34 years, I have gradually, in bits and pieces, revealed my understanding of my calling, the message of the Scriptures, and/or the white-hot hatred the living God harbors for those who choose to reject, twist, and/or distort the truth that Jesus Christ handed down to his disciples as the apostolic teaching. Over that span of time, I have not been shy about telling you, not only that God called me to do what I am doing but also why he called me to do it. Along the way, I have explained various and sundry parts of the 7 sealed messages the prophets hid in the text of the Hebrew Scriptures, but I have done it in such a way as to make it difficult for anyone but the most dedicated to put even one of those 7 messages together into a coherent whole. That was intentional on my part. In this issue, I am going to tell you how God views the current push to develop computers with artificial intelligence, AI, but only after reviewing what I have already told you God has planned for this generation. July 2024. In this issue of the Voice of Elijah newsletter, I told you the time had finally arrived for me to put together a few of the things I have written over the past 34 years, so that you true believers can see the 7 threads in the tapestry God's prophets wove into the fabric of the Old Testament. I told you that, by the time I have shown you all 7, you should be able to see just how stupid the unbelievers who contributed to the corruption and loss of the apostolic teaching really are. I said Satan's minions have always been obstinate, obstructionist, and obsequiously observant of their own abjectly idiotic perversion of the truth. But I also told you it won't be long before the things that the Apostle Peter describes in 2 Peter 3, come to pass, and the truth is just as he stated. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3b through 7, HSSB. In the last days mockers will come with mockery, those who are walking in accordance with their own selfish desires and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell fast asleep, since the beginning of creation, everything continues to be the same. For wanting this to be true, it has escaped their notice that the heavens were from long ago, and the earth stood up together with them out of water, and through water by the word of the living God, by which the world at that time, which was flooded by water, was done away with. So now the heavens and the earth, which have been stored up by the same word, are being kept for a fire on the day of the sentencing and eternal damnation of depraved men. After I showed you what Peter says, I pointed out 3 statements he makes, the significance of which you may have overlooked. Listen carefully. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, HSSB. So now the heavens and the earth, which have been stored up by the same word, are being kept for a fire on the day of the sentencing and eternal damnation of depraved men. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, HSSB. So the day of his majesty will come like a thief, on which day the heavens will pass away, whistling, and then elementary things, which are going to be incinerated, will be undone, and the earth and the works done on her will be found to be what they are. Since all these things are going to be undone like this, what sort of person should you be in holy behavior and godliness, while expecting and hurrying the arrival of the day of the living God, because of which day the heavens will be undone by being burned, and elementary things is going to be melted by being incinerated? 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 18b, HSSB. The glory is his, both now and in the day of the age to come, without doubt. After I showed you that, I told you I am well aware of the arguments that those who have been duped by Satan use to prove the 7 days of creation are literal 24-hour days. I said that insipid stupidity evolved out of John Darby's dumb dispensational doctrine in which he claimed the Old Testament designation Israel can only refer literally to the Jews. I said his vapid beliefs in that regard are based on his total ignorance of the significance of the Hebrew idiom, cut off from, which I explain in the book Not All Israel is Israel. I reminded you I have also shown how Satan's dispensational lie has come to be the dominant belief in our time, in a booklet titled Wanna Hear a Whopper? I said I have no interest in once again refuting that lie. My only interest is in showing you what you need to know about the day of His Majesty, which is what is commonly called the day of the Lord. I showed you Peter knew that day is an age that will begin when this current age has ended. He reveals that in this statement. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 18b, HSSB. The glory is his, both now and in the day of the age to come, without doubt. After I swatted aside the idiotic notion that the 7 literal days, ages, of creation are 7 literal 24-hour days, I went on to show you why Satan has fought so vociferously over the past 2 centuries, to keep his minions mindlessly believing idiotic concepts that are securely ensconced in the mind of unsuspecting dupes, who have no idea that the myopic mental midget who dominates them has them riding his express train straight into the pits of hell. But I told you that dim-witted serial killer has been spreading the lie about the 7 days of creation to cover up an even bigger lie regarding a truth stated in the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. I reminded you I have already put his lie to rest in the booklet titled In the Image and Likeness of God, so you may want to read, or reread, what I explain there to fill in the gaps in what I say here. In that booklet, I refute the ridiculous notion that the Adam mentioned in Genesis 1:26 and 27, is our forefather. I also pointed out the fact that what the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15:45 and 46, about the 2 Adams, demonstrates he knew Jesus Christ is the second Adam, the Adam that Moses describes in the first chapter of Genesis. And he is the only Adam God has ever created in his own image and likeness. After I made you responsible for what you believe about the things I have explained, I gave you a bit more information for which you will be held responsible. 1. In Genesis 1:26 and 27, Moses tells us God planned to create Jesus Christ in his image and likeness on the 6th day of creation. 2. In that same passage, Moses has also told us God said he would create male and female believers in his image and likeness on the 6th day of creation. I told you that is what the Apostle John had in mind when he wrote 1 John 3:2. 3. Since true believers have not yet been created in the image and likeness of God, the only logical conclusion is, the 7th day of creation has not yet begun, and we are still living in the 6th day. Therefore, those who seek to qualify still have an opportunity to be transformed into God's image before the 7th day begins, which is precisely what Paul is explaining in Hebrews 3:1 through 4:11, where he is speaking in terms of 1. God building a house for himself at the end of this age, and 2. This current age as the 6th day, that is, today. I told you the beliefs that stand behind what Paul says in Hebrews 3:1 through 4:11 are the same beliefs the other apostles believed. That is, their beliefs are 1. Genesis 1:26 and 27 tells us God made a promise that he would supernaturally transform those who are able to prove they believe his promise into his very own image and likeness on the 6th day of creation, when he fulfills the promise. 2. The transformation of true believers into the image and likeness of God will occur on the 6th day of creation, at the resurrection of the righteous, which is the fulfillment of the promise. 3. Since the resurrection of the righteous has not yet occurred, we know the 6th day of creation has not yet ended, and the 7th day, the age in which God will rest, has not yet begun. 4. We are still living in the 6th day of creation, so we still have hope of resting with God after the resurrection of the righteous, when the 7th day begins. 5. The 7th day of creation will begin immediately after God has fulfilled the promise by resurrecting the righteous in his own image and likeness. After I laid all that out for you, to give the mockers that Peter mentions in 2 Peter 3:3 and 4, ample opportunity to deny the truth regarding the 7th day of creation, I went on to show you what the prophets have said about the circumstances that will come into play when that 7th day of rest finally arrives. But I first showed you how the book of Revelation describes it. I told you that, if that doesn't terrify you, it is only because you don't believe the consummation of the 6th day is right around the corner. I said it might help you to envision the absolute horror that is facing the billions of unsuspecting people who believe Satan's ridiculous lies, if you make a mental overlay of how John the Revelator describes it and place that horrific imagery right smack dab on top of what Peter says about the inferno, that will usher in the 7th day. I told you that if that combination does not help, just wait. What the prophets say about the Lord's day should absolutely scare the pants off anyone with even half a lick of common sense. Then I showed you my translation of Revelation 17 and 18, where John the Revelator describes the circumstances that will exist here on the great harlot, Mother Earth, after the 7th day gets underway. I warned you that, in spite of what the majority will choose to believe here at the end of the age, the author of the book of Revelation is describing circumstances leading up to a nuclear holocaust that announces the beginning of the 7th day of creation, the Lord's Day, and the absolute horror that will face the few radiation-poisoned survivors who must deal with the aftermath as they slowly die an agonizing death. I told you to mock me if you will, but the prophets do not hold back on this one, and they tell it like it will be, not the way fools want it to be. But I warned you that you need to pay close attention to Revelation 18:6 and 7, because it is referring back to something the prophet Isaiah said that will tie everything together all neat and tidy for those who have eyes to see. Then I reminded you that, in the very first issue of the Voice of Elijah newsletter, I told you Isaiah is using the parabolic image of Babylon in Isaiah 14, where he describes the appearance of the Antichrist as one who is parabolically like the king of Babylon. And I told you Isaiah parabolically describes the salvation of the remnant of God's people, as well as the destiny of the harlot, planet Earth, in Isaiah 13, where he makes it clear that those who refuse to keep Sabbath on the 6th day will be forced to do so on the 7th. When that final day of creation begins with the dazzling white light of all those nuclear warheads going off, one after the other, making the sun, moon, and stars pale in comparison. Then I showed you my interim translation of Isaiah 13, so you could see for yourself what Isaiah had in mind. I asked you if you noticed how, after describing the devastation of planet Earth, Isaiah obliquely refers to it as Babylon in verse 19. I told you to make a note of that and reminded you that you had already seen that parabolic imagery in Revelation 17 and 18. Then I gave you a heads up by telling you that you are going to see it again later on. I next gave you my interim translation of Isaiah 14, where Isaiah is describing the perspective of the members of the remnant who enter the rest of God on the seventh day of creation after being resurrected in the image and likeness of God at the end of the sixth day. I told you Isaiah depicts them as looking back at the reign of the Antichrist and the predicament that he and those who followed him in trying to create a stupid utopia here on earth will face at that time, when they are going to be parabolically forced to keep Sabbath on the seventh day of creation. After showing you what the master prophet Isaiah says about the Lord's redeemed resting on the Lord's day, immediately after the destruction of Mystery Babylon, I went on to show you the incredible insight that some of the other prophets contribute to our understanding of what is yet to come, as fools work feverishly to craft a utopia here on planet Earth. I told you the secret ingredient that all the master chefs of the perfect are overlooking is the one God Himself slipped into their mixing bowl. War. That's the one that is going to bring their stupid desire to hide from the angry jealous God of Israel to a screeching halt. And when war does the dirty work God intended, they won't be able to say He didn't give them sufficient warning. He did, but they stupidly believe it's all just a myth. So I warned you that, if you have a brain, God expects you to use it. Examine the evidence. I told you there is much more to the truth than what I presented at that time. I next began looking at the evidence by giving you my interim translation of Obadiah, a prophet who prophesied more than a century before Isaiah came along. I told you he got the ball rolling on the basis of what he could see Moses had already explained in the teaching of Moses about the seventh day of creation. I also told you that, to understand what Obadiah says concerning Edom, you need to know that the people called Edom were the descendants of Esau. As you may remember, Esau was the jug-headed brother of Jacob who stupidly sold his right to inherit the promise, thereby leaving his descendants out in the cold while the descendants of Jacob shared the right to inherit what was promised. But the key to understanding what Obadiah says in his brief treatise resides in the curious combination of verse 15 and verse 18. In verse 15, he tells the descendants of Esau they will get what they deserve, not because of what Esau did in rejecting the promise, but because they did the same through their own actions. In verse 18, he tells them they will be locked out forever when members of the houses of Jacob and Joseph are made in the very image and likeness of the eternally burning person that God is. That will occur on the eve of the fire that erupts without warning on the morning of the seventh day. I told you the next prophet after Obadiah to speak concerning the nuclear fire that will announce the beginning of God's Sabbath day of rest, is the prophet Joel. I explained that his entire prophecy is a parable and told you that you should pay attention to what he says about the parabolic locusts, who bring about the parabolic famine of truth that will be ended by the teacher, who comes along right before the seventh day begins. I reminded you that I have already, in the August 2016 issue of the Voice of Elijah update, explained how the parabolic locusts that Joel describes provide a much-needed connection to the same parabolic imagery in chapter 9 of the book of Revelation. Then I gave you my interim translation of the first chapter of the book of Joel and told you that what the prophet says there is inextricably linked to the things Isaiah tells us about the seventh day of creation in Isaiah 13 and 14. I told you that is because Isaiah quotes Joel 1:15, almost verbatim in Isaiah 13:6. I challenged you to take a look, keeping in mind the fact that Isaiah was prophesying more than a century after Joel. After giving you my interim translation of Joel 2, I warned you not to take any of Joel's statements literally, but especially those concerning edible items that sprout out of the ground. I said my suggestion would be to think parabolically in terms of what all those parabolic locusts might be and what they might want to consume, and then go and learn the meaning of what Moses says in Deuteronomy 8:1-3. After that, I gave you my interim translation of Joel 3 and reminded you that the point of Joel's entire parable is to explain what the circumstances will be like right before the seventh day begins. I also told you that if you have a good cross-reference, you will be able to see where the same parabolic imagery is used in the book of Revelation. After giving you my interim translation of Amos 5, I told you the ostensible purpose of the things Amos tells us about the seventh day is to link it to the restoration of the house of Israel to corporate Israel, after they have been cut off from that corporate body. I said he shares that mission with the prophet Hosea, but I pointed out that Isaiah saw an opportunity in the things Amos says in Amos 5 and used it to explain a bit more about the role the teacher, that Joel mentions in Joel 2:23, will play in the days leading up to the nuclear holocaust that initiates the seventh day of creation. I told you he explains that parabolic imagery more fully in Isaiah 29-35. But I said my only interest in what I was explaining was to show you how Isaiah, in Isaiah 29, expands on the parabolic darkness Amos mentions in Amos 5:18, which is also the nether gloom he mentions in verse 20. After telling you all that, I gave you my interim translation of Isaiah 29, and I told you Isaiah's point in that chapter is, most folks are going to have a late wake-up call when the seventh day dawns on them. As a result, when that time arrives, those poor dupes are going to wake up with a start to find that a few, those who have been awake for quite a while by that time, are already all dressed up and ready for that day. I told you that is why I showed you what he says about darkness and nether gloom. Then I went on to show you what the prophets have to say about the Lord's day. I gave you my interim translation of the entire book of Zephaniah, who came along nearly a century after Isaiah, because he has a laser focus on it. I said it should be obvious to anyone who is paying attention that Zephaniah is speaking parabolically to the inhabitants of planet Earth as though they are living in a city. I said a key takeaway from what he says is the identification of the city, which can be determined by starting with what Zephaniah says in Zephaniah 2:15a. I told you that if you know your Bible, you already know Zephaniah is giving his reader a hint that they should go back and read what Isaiah said about the parabolic harlot Babylon in Isaiah 47. As a reminder, I gave you my interim translation of that chapter and told you that, after reading it, all the pieces should fall into place for you so that you can understand why John the Revelator calls planet Earth a prostitute and mystery Babylon, in Revelation 17 and 18. But I told you that if you needed a reminder, you should take a look at what Isaiah says about the woman who reigns over all the midget-minded morons who currently rule the nations. I warned you that, if the information I had given you up to that point was neatly packed away in your carry-on, you should be able to see Revelation 17 and 18, is describing events here on earth that will occur during the run-up to, and aftermath of, the sixth day of creation coming to an end. I challenged you to look at the text and told you John the Revelator is obviously pointing back to Isaiah 47:7 and 8, in Revelation 18:7. For that reason you should be able to see what he is talking about, if you want to. I told you that, at that point, all you needed to know to round out the information I had provided is why Isaiah calls planet Earth Babylon. And I said if you know what happened at the Tower of Babel, where God set a limit that imbecilic utopians and their stupid AI will never be able to cross, it should all make perfect sense. We are at the brink, looking down over the precipice, knowing full well the living God is still in control, with plans to catch the unsuspecting totally off guard. But I told you that you also need to factor in what Malachi says about the teacher, whose activities are going to introduce the circumstances Isaiah describes in Isaiah 29 through 35. Malachi spells that out fairly clearly, provided you have enough intelligence to accept it, in Malachi 4. After I showed you what the prophets of Israel, from as far back as 845 BC and all the way down to 460 BC, were saying about the beginning of the final day of creation, I told you that, without exception, they all knew that day of a blazing inferno was yet to come. Then I went on to show you the apostles believed that very same thing. I said you need to be aware of that if you have any interest at all in knowing the truth. For that reason I told you I would explain it for you, otherwise, you might make a very big misstep and have me to blame. After I transitioned to what the apostles wrote about the seventh day of creation, I reminded you that I had already shown you 2 Peter 3, where Peter clearly reveals he knew all about the conflagration that will come at the beginning of the Lord's day. I also pointed out that he also confirms the apostles were still waiting for that seventh day to begin, when he spoke on the day of Pentecost, Acts 2, 1 through 21, and quoted what Joel had written about that day in Joel 2, 28 through 32. Then I showed you what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 through 11, where he reveals the seventh day of creation, the Lord's day, was at the very forefront of his mind. He makes it clear in that passage that those who believe the apostolic teaching will know when the seventh day is about to begin. I told you that should convince you, and will convince anyone who is still awake, that the church today has lost all but a wee bit of the truth that Jesus Christ handed down to his apostles. I showed you where, in his other letter to the local church in Thessalonica, Paul reveals something even more astounding as to why the agents of Satan have worked so hard over the last 2 centuries to distort the truth about the nuclear holocaust that is going to occur at the very beginning of the seventh day of creation. In 2 Thessalonians 2, where Paul describes Satan appearing as the Antichrist, he issues a dire warning to anyone who believes the seventh day of creation has already come. I pointed out that he is warning true believers against believing one specific lie, which he calls the lie in verse 11. I also told you that is, the lie I have put to rest in the minds of true believers by what I have written. For that reason his warning does not bode well for anyone who wants to stubbornly cling to the mistaken notion that the church has not already committed the apostasy he mentions in verse 3. Then I told you it will not be obvious to those who cannot read the original Greek text, but there are, at the very least, 3 other places where Paul refers to the seventh day of creation and indicates it is still to come. We can be sure that is the case because he uses exactly the same phrase in those 3 passages as he uses in 2 Thessalonians 2:2. He calls it the day of the Lord, which I normally translate as either the day of His Majesty or the day of our Master, depending on whether or not it occurs in conjunction with the possessive pronoun. The first instance in which Paul uses that phrase is 1 Corinthians 5:5. But in a couple of other places, he links the phrase day of the Lord to the end of the 6th day, by referring to it as a consummation, Greek telos, of the current age. The first occurrence is in 1 Corinthians 1:8, the second is in 2 Corinthians 1:13. Then in 1 Corinthians 10:11, Paul refers to the Lord's day as a consummation of the past ages, which reveals he was well aware of the fact that the 7 days of creation are, in fact, ages. After I showed you Paul refers to the 7th day of creation as the consummation of the things God has done on the first 6 days of creation, I showed you 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 24, where he tells us the consummation of this age follows the second coming. Then I concluded by showing you what Paul said in Hebrews 3:1 through 4:11, where he once again warns his readers to be careful to make sure they do not believe the lie that tells us the 7th day has already begun. If you found this video about the AI revolution and biblical prophecy eye-opening, you're going to want to see what comes next. In the next video, the author exposes the 3 convincing lies Satan has used to deceive mankind about the true nature of God, lies that connect directly to the AI revolution discussed in this video. Click the video now to discover how Satan's deception relates to Mystery Babylon and why an accurate understanding of these things is critical before the 7th day of creation begins with the nuclear holocaust.